Somewhere on the edge of a growing city, there is a flat, unremarkable piece of land. Overgrown grass, a rusted fence, maybe a faded sign from a business that closed years ago. To most people driving past, it is nothing. To an industrial developer, it is the beginning of a $10 million building. The distance between those two things, empty dirt and a fully leased distribution center, is not luck. It is a sequence, a very specific, very disciplined sequence, and almost every step in it can add value or destroy it, depending on how carefully it is handled. This is the story of that sequence. Not a single deal, but the pattern behind nearly all of them.
It starts with land selection. And land selection starts with a question most people never think to ask. What makes one empty lot worth developing and another empty lot worth ignoring? The answer sits almost entirely in three things: access, power, and zoning. Access means proximity to a major highway interchange, ideally within a few miles, because trucks are the lifeblood of an industrial building, and every extra mile of local road adds cost and time to every shipment that ever leaves the site.
Power means electrical capacity. This sounds unglamorous, but it has become one of the single biggest constraints in industrial development. A modern distribution center, especially one with refrigeration or heavy automation, might require several megawatts of power. If the local utility can't deliver that capacity, or if delivering it requires a lengthy, expensive upgrade to substation infrastructure, the entire project can stall for a year or more before a single shovel touches the ground.
And zoning means the land is legally permitted or can realistically be rezoned for industrial use. A beautiful, well-located parcel zoned for residential development is not a warehouse opportunity. It's a different business entirely. Once a developer identifies a site that checks these boxes, the land itself typically costs somewhere in the range of $200,000 to $600,000 per acre, depending heavily on the market. Significantly higher near major ports and metro areas, considerably lower in secondary logistics corridors. For a 20-acre site suitable for a modern distribution center, that land cost alone might run $4 to $8 million before a single dollar is spent on construction. This is where many aspiring developers make their first mistake, falling in love with the land before confirming what can actually be built on it. That confirmation comes through entitlement, the legal process of securing the permits, approvals, and zoning clearances required to build. Entitlement is rarely fast. In many markets, it takes anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, involving traffic studies, environmental reviews, utility coordination, and public hearings where neighboring property owners get a chance to object. A developer who purchases land before securing entitlement is taking on real risk. The risk that the project they envision may never receive approval in the form they need. This is why many developers structure their land purchase with a contingency period, sometimes called a due diligence period, giving them the right to walk away if entitlement doesn't come through on acceptable terms.
Once entitlement is secured, the project moves into site planning and engineering, determining exactly where the building sits on the parcel, how trucks will circulate through the site, where the parking and trailer storage will go, and how stormwater, sewer, and utility connections will be routed.
This is also where the building's core specifications get locked in. The specifications that, months later, will determine which tenants want to lease it. Clear height is one of the most important. A modern distribution center is typically built with 32 to 36 feet of clear height, allowing tenants to install taller racking and increase their storage density. Older buildings, sometimes only 24 feet,
are functionally obsolete for many large logistics users, even if they're structurally sound. Dock-door ratio matters just as much. A well-specified distribution center might include one dock door for every 8 to 10,000 square feet of building, enough to allow rapid truck turnover without creating a bottleneck. And column spacing, the distance between structural support columns, needs to be wide enough, often 50 or 60 feet apart, to allow efficient racking layouts without columns interrupting valuable storage space.
With the site plan finalized, construction begins. And this is typically where the largest single cost of the entire project gets spent. Industrial construction costs vary by region and specification, but a straightforward, non-refrigerated distribution center typically costs somewhere between $70 and $100 per square foot to build, including the building shell, site work, utilities, and basic finishes. For a 200,000 square foot building, a common size for a modern regional distribution center, that puts total construction costs in the range of $14 to $20 million.
Add the land cost from earlier, and a project of this scale can easily represent a total investment of $20 to $25 million before it generates a single dollar of rent. Financing a project like this rarely comes from one source. Developers typically use a construction loan, a short-term loan, often covering 60 to 70% of total project cost, that funds the building phase and is repaid once the property is completed and either sold or refinanced with permanent long-term debt. The remaining cost is covered by the developer's own equity or equity from investment partners who share in the eventual profit. Construction itself typically takes 12 to 18 months for a building of this size, depending on site complexity, permitting delays, and the availability of labor and materials, all of which have become considerably less predictable in recent years. Now comes one of the most consequential decisions in the entire process. Does the developer build speculatively, without a tenant lined up in advance? Or do they secure a tenant first through what's known as a build-to-suit arrangement? A build-to-suit deal reduces risk substantially. The tenant is committed before construction even begins, often through a long-term lease, 10 years or more, sometimes with the tenant contributing input on the building specifications. The trade-off is that the tenant, having that leverage, often negotiates a lower rent than the developer might achieve on the open market.
Speculative development, sometimes simply called spec development, carries more risk but potentially more reward. The developer builds without a committed tenant, betting that strong underlying demand in the market will produce a lease, sometimes even before construction finishes, sometimes months after completion. In a market with industrial vacancy under 5%, this bet often pays off. In an oversupplied market, a speculative building can sit empty for a year or more, burning carrying costs with no income to offset them.
This is the point where many projects succeed or fail, not because of a construction mistake, but because of a leasing miscalculation made months, sometimes years earlier. Once the building is complete and a tenant is secured, the property enters what's called stabilization, the period where the asset settles into predictable, ongoing operation. This is also typically when the original construction loan gets replaced with permanent financing, and often when the developer decides whether to hold the asset long-term or sell it. If the decision is to sell, the building's value is now determined the same way any income-producing property is valued, primarily through its net operating income and the prevailing market cap rate. For a well-located, well-leased modern distribution center, cap rates in recent years have generally ranged from 5 to 6.5%, though this moves with broader interest rate conditions. Consider a completed building, generating, say, $600,000 in annual net operating income, sold at a 5.5% cap rate. That produces a sale price of just under $11 million, a figure that, depending on how efficiently the land, entitlement, and construction phases were managed, may represent a meaningful profit over the total development cost, or in a poorly executed project, barely cover it. This is the part that separates disciplined developers from lucky ones. The difference between a project that returns 15% and one that barely breaks even often isn't the finished building. Completed distribution centers tend to look remarkably similar from the outside. The difference is almost always upstream. Land bought at a disciplined basis. Entitlement secured without unnecessary delay. Construction costs controlled against a realistic budget, and a leasing strategy matched honestly to actual market conditions rather than optimistic assumptions.
None of this happens without risk. Entitlement can stall. Construction costs can run over budget, a persistent challenge across the industry in recent years. Interest rates can rise between the start of construction and the refinancing of permanent debt, changing the economics of the entire project. And demand, which looked strong when the land was purchased, can soften by the time the building is ready to lease. A disciplined developer plans for these risks explicitly, building contingency into the construction budget, stress testing the project against a slower lease-up scenario, and stress testing it again against a higher interest rate environment at refinancing.
This is why industrial development, despite looking simple from the outside, buy land, build a box, lease it out, is genuinely one of the more demanding disciplines in real estate. Every stage compounds the risk, or the reward, created by the stage before it. That empty lot on the edge of the city was never really about the dirt. It was about a sequence of decisions: where to build, what to build, how to finance it, who to lease it to, and when to sell it. Each one narrowing the gap between a piece of raw land and a building that, if everything goes right, is worth considerably more than the sum of what it costs to create. This is Trov Estate. Every warehouse standing today started exactly where this one did, as nothing. Understanding what happens in between is what separates a developer from a speculator.